Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear visitors and guests, not at least dear participants of this online discussion, I want to welcome you to this event on behalf of the University of Kassel and the Philipps University of Marburg. Let me briefly say a few words about the topic of this online discussion. In the last years, we have facing a series of complex and overlapping global crises, such as the corona pandemic and the Russian invasion, that forced us to think about the methodological and theoretical tools we have been using to understand our world, which one have worked so far and which have not. While a crisis is not necessarily something new, particularly in the global south, these recent crises have challenged the mainstream doctrines in political science and social science and economics. More, they are directly challenging the center of world knowledge production. The general propositions that textbooks give us no longer seems to be working. Therefore, we need to look for something new while also checking which parts of the discussion have been lost in the path of time. In our project, it became clear to us that the succession of cultural, linguistic and spatial terms that social science have faced also have contributed to pushing heterodox and materialistic theories into the background. Returning to them and updating them may show us an alternative to face this world of pessimism we are immersing ourselves in. To be clear, we are not arguing for a material return. We are only claiming a material turn for a better understanding of new dynamics. We are committed to this attempt in our regional centers at the University of Kassel, here in the Latin American Research Center, CELA, and at the University of Marburg with the Center for Near and the Middle East, CNMS. At both universities, institutions and projects have been established by funding instruments of the Federal Ministry of Education and Research, BMBF, to build up regional expertise together with our partners in the Maghreb and Latin America. In these research projects, we turn our attention to the crisis, to social inequality, global development, trying to explain this phenomena and point out alternatives for our future. It was with this mindset that the research project Raw Material Extractivism in Latin America and the Maghreb was established. Against the backdrop of increasing international and global inequalities, Extractivism.de turns its research to the ongoing and deep dependency of many societies in the global south on the extraction and the export of natural resources and raw materials. What is the role of commodities and rents within the global south? How to analyze the internal dynamics, crisis and drivers of change of rent societies? With that in mind, we are very interested in connecting to an ongoing discussion on the state, class and structures with our own framework, without forgetting never cultural and intersectional dimensions. This research has been started by the participants of this online discussion today, and it has for decades challenged much the Western mainstream understanding of what is key of grasping and producing development. I am delighted to welcome these two panels with such distinguished scholars from different parts of the world, and I hope you enjoy it and have a spirited discussion, and I'm already looking forward to the results. I wish you a very pleasant event and hope to see you soon in our beautiful city of Kassel. Enjoy and goodbye. And goodbye.
Great. So that was Professor Burchardt. So as he said, we organized this panel here in Extractivism, partly from an idea that after decades of dismantling the state as a concept and as its local, exploring the differences of agencies, societies, socioeconomic dynamics worldwide. It was a much needed process, however, in this process, many of us seem to have lost the grasp of the bigger picture, on the macro level. And only a few nations or a few countries managed to actually profit from globalization and neoliberal governments and liberalization of development policies. We argue here in Extractivism that the many crises we experience, so climate change, COVID-19, Ukraine war changes, many of us expected. So the prevailing mainstream doctrines, many of the prevailing mainstream doctrines have been insufficient as explanations for socioeconomic predictions concerning growth, development, prosperity, and peace did not materialize. Words like pessimism, isolationism, populism, war, conflict, nationalism are returning to our lexicon more and more frequently. And it's because of those reasons that we invited to more younger generations to revisit its structuralism arguments in discussing development theory and development policies. Heterodox arguments, they tend to shed light away from the Western neoliberal utopia, seeking to grasp better the complex reality of class struggles, conflicts for resources, predatory consumption of nation, concerning and given interesting, more complex lenses to the complex topic of the development, particularly in the global south. Therefore, we have invited us to, we developed these two panels. The first one I'm moderating, and it goes until we're going to have a 15 minutes break and then invite the second generation panelists and sorry, we invite the second generation panelists and then we go into 8 German time. I do believe, yes, okay. So we can start. I'm hoping that Professor Bresser join us soon. He's not in yet. But today we have 3 panelists. Unfortunately, our guest, Erika Heinert, Professor Pereira, who's not joined us yet, and Professor Kahn. So I'm going to introduce Elsenhans and Kahn, and later when Professor Bresser is in, I'm going to introduce it as the final speaker. So Professor Elsenhans is an emeritus professor of international relations at the University of Leipzig. He has worked with many German universities such as in Berlin, Frankfurt, and Marburg, and fall of capitalism, international politics, North and South relations, development policy and theory, and political economies of rents. During his career, he specialized in many countries from the global south, particularly Algeria, Vietnam, Bangladesh, and Mali. He is a proponent of global Keynesianism and a prominent advocate of heterodox political economy. Professor Mushtaq is a British Bangladeshi professor of heterodox economics at the school. His work focuses on economics of the global south country, particularly South Asian and African countries, such as Bangladesh, Tanzania, and Thailand. He is a leading researcher on anti-corruption, governance, economic development, and political settlements, the concept that he developed. And his work range of topics such as industrial policy, institutional economics, rent-seeking, pattern compliance networks, and the institution of the state. He's also the executive director of Anti-Corruption Evidence Research Consortium and has advised many global development initiatives such as the Africa and Industrial Policy Task Forces and World Bank panels on experts in policy implementations. With that being said, I inform you when you still have 5 minutes, and then when you reach 15, I will inform you again to wrap it up your timing. Thank you very much. Let's hope we have an amazing discussion. I'm sorry, I think your mic is not on.
Now you can understand?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, I thank you very much for the invitation. I'm perhaps a little bit older, perhaps I'm really going very far back in the past theories, but nevertheless, I announced it, yeah, so don't be afraid, don't be angry. After the presentation of Luíza, I would first start with my main argument, that is, I consider rent as the normal form of surplus. And that means that raw material rents are a special case. But they share with rent as a normal case that they are not triggering the transition to capitalism. They are not giving premium to economically efficient use of surplus, but to political connections. And therefore, there is no automatic link between productivity increases, which occur also in rent-based societies, and capitalism. And the major implication of this argument is that I consider that we have at any level of capitalist development the danger of a return to rent-based structures. Complementary to this argument is the argument that profit is a special category of surplus, political intervention without oligopoly, without monopoly, just on anonymous markets. And for this being appropriated, there has to be efficient demand, enough effective demand. That comes from net investment spending. In order that the producers of the consumption goods industry sell their products at a higher rate than what they have paid for wages, directly, indirectly for taxes, there has to be wages which have been paid by somebody else. And this somebody else are the producers of investment goods. And therefore, profit is, in the Kaleckian sense, linked to net investment goods spending. That leads to the question of the causes of investment. My argument is demand increasing investment requires rising mass incomes. I have four categories of investment: rationalization, incomes paid out to the factors of production does not increase demand. Extension of known products, obviously that requires, in order to be sold, increasing demand. Extension, investment in the production of new products which do not replace old products. I think it's obvious that there needs also extending demand. And then defensive investment, capital deepening, in order to avoid the consequences of rising costs of labor. I think it's implicit that labor costs have to rise. I share with the SOAS book that the consumption problem cannot be solved by the middle classes and the entrepreneurs because of the mechanisms of competition. So ultimately, that it's only the working class, the average total demand. Therefore, my argument is that capitalism requires rising mass incomes, which I defend relatively generally and in many places. For these 3 points there is the persistence of rent, that's the normal way. But what's necessary to explain is why profit can emerge. Now, my argument is that lagging behind economies under the condition of the coexistence of threat-based and profit-based economies are profit-based economies are characterized by rising productivities, but productivities rise in different rates, at different rates in different production lines. And that means, profit-based economies advance rent-based economies to different degrees according to production lines. I think that the Ricardian formulation of comparative advantages is valid. I do not check this has no relevance. I share, however, the argument that it is not linked to factor endowments. If comparative advantage is relevant, then rent-based societies are specialized on products where the price elasticity or the income elasticity have highest advances in productivity in new products. That means also that prices of rent-based economies in products which are old, which are low price elasticity of demand are relatively low, so that they enjoy high prices. And in products which are new, their productivity levels are high, their prices, the possible prices they can charge in really prices in capitalist economies follow productivities. There is a convergence of productivity in monetary terms, following relative productivities in different production lines. If relative productivities in different production lines are the differences in levels in productivity, then rent-based economies are characterized by differences in monetary productivities. And that takes the form of the opposition of world market price system. Productivities in world market prices and relative profit-based economies, but do not converge in rent-based economies. And therefore, the basic capitalist mechanism that is rendering the economy homogeneous by adjustments of relative prices does not work. My argument, therefore, is that there is a basic absence of a major mechanism of flexible, and I call it structural heterogeneity. Structural heterogeneity has a major implication for the society. The capitalist mechanism where labor shouting and therefore small changes of demand lead to appropriate allocation of investment does not work because labor shouting will result in inflexibility. There will be only inflationary pressures or balance of trade deficits. Therefore, the mechanism of the relatively easy adjustment between capital and labor does not work. Therefore, I argue that there is an ambivalence of rent. Rent is a source of income which can be used to be invested in making these economies flexible, that is, in building up production lines which are not yet profitable, but which will become profitable if income distribution changes. And it's a block to that process because it gives a premium to political connectedness and to political economic efficiency. I've developed in that context my theory of the state class, which was already mentioned there. A state class means there is a class which emerges because surplus is available of rent, provided that is appropriated by a centralized institution we normally call the state, and it's not invested in the rent generating, and the rent would disappear to the benefit of consumers outside the country. Therefore, state classes need the state for appropriation and allocation of the rent. They are contradictory because there is no economic mechanism for that control, and there may be a privilege there, self-privilege dependency instead in a political sense. If I arrive at that argument, the question is, what is development? And I would argue development is the mobilizing of rent for making capitalism possible by upgrading factors of production in order to react flexibly to changes in demand. That implies that I consider it's important to de-demonize capitalism. The argument that capitalism is responsible for all problems keeps us from considering practical solutions to structural change. Therefore, I consider that we need to renew development theory and refuse the concentration of accumulation. That does not mean that I'm against accumulation. That means that I think there are two different types of technical progress. Technical progress in the reduction of the cost of standard application and technical progress in efficiency, in excellence of the product. And I am in favor of technical progress in order to lower the cost of production of standard products. That means that I have a certain concept of what is overcoming in the development. I would argue it is making possible in both our technology production and both are linked together, greater batches of production also for investment goods if demand is more homogeneous, and simpler quality requirements if mass consumption prevails. At that point of my argument, it's clear that I consider the role of the intellectuals as a structure in a struggle for the hegemony at a theoretical level. There's on one hand, capitalism is rising mass incomes and appropriate technologies. I consider that the rent-based character of the most economies of the South are extended now that we are in a new phase of the international division of labor, which I want shortly to characterize. I think that we have the emergence of what I call reading industries, that is, where productivity leads and through books, against learning by doing industries where practice in production is important. And that implies that there is a new comparative cost advantage for the South in reading industries. The South has lower lags in readings industries in comparison to the West, compared to the learning, specialization according to comparative advantage does not imply that comparative advantage that countries with comparative advantage are superior. It means only that in these branches of production, they are less backward. And that implies that the global South may overtake the West, at least in production lines which are important for employment in the West. And this is reinforced by the capacities of the global South, or at least many countries in the global South. I think, that the transformation of comparative cost advantage nowadays depends very much on the capacity of devaluing the low purchasing power parity because of the availability of a local surplus of wage goods. That's why the East Asian economies are so superior to the African ones, because the African ones have no food Asians have. That leads me to the characteristic of the actual crisis, that is trend travels west. The South determines now prices for many products, and exchange rates imbalance important ranges of labor in the first world have become uncompetitive. The production increases below productivity increases, and production increase below productivity increase invariably implies underconsumption. I think the West contributes to an underconsumptive crisis, and in an underconsumptive crisis, any government, any social structure will allow state appropriation of surplus not be appropriated under market conditions. Therefore, my argument is rent travels west, and there's a danger of globalization of rent. The organizers have asked me where I see my contributions. I think the first contribution was the overcoming underdevelopment by mass consumption to mass production. The second, weight classes, that has been so massively received that many people quote the state class, but no longer the author. Then the third contribution, capitalism, depends on the extension of popular poles of industries, ultimately on rising mass consumptions, and then naturally, by recent publications, the danger of globalization of rent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. I think we can go straight with Professor Kahn, and then we're trying to arrange, but maybe the Professor Bresser is not joining, and we're sending him a mail, and if not, we rearrange it and open have more time for discussions. Professor Kahn, I will write down again the timings. Okay.
Thank you. Actually, I've been an admirer of Professor Elsenhans' work for some time, and there are overlaps in what we do. I'm not going to give a very detailed description of my work, but just an overview of the kinds of questions that I've been asking, and then I hope we will have a conversation. So my work began by asking the motivating question was, I was looking, this was around 30 years ago, looking at the difference between East Asian and South Asian development. And at that time, both East Asia and South Asia had superficially quite similar policies, industrial policies, development policies, and some of them also had quite similar political systems, authoritarian developmental states, and so on. And yet they performed very differently. And on top of that, both South Asia and East Asia, and I was challenging the interpretations which was saying that East Asia was neo-Bavarian rule-following societies, because my informality and corruption and forms of clientelism in East Asia, just as there was in South Asia. So there was a puzzle about why some policies were implemented better. And that took me towards the development of what eventually became the political settlements framework, because I began to look at a number of interdependent factors which were interacting in delivering outcomes. The first was that it was clear that formal and informal power structures are both important. Now, heterodox economists have a good understanding of formal power structure acting behind the scenes were actually extremely important. And these were different forms of patronage networks, clientage networks, trust networks that were operating in these societies. The second component that was very important was this issue of capabilities and organizational capabilities in particular. And I'm convinced now that the main difference between countries in terms of their levels of development and performance is their capabilities that are not good to go into. But it's not, development is not just about putting capital and labor together. The missing important fact, which is much more important, is how do you organize that supply and demand, and that requires a lot of learning by doing. So some countries have very strong organizational capabilities, have very powerful organizations, but they are engaged in extractive activities, not extractive in terms of raw materials, but extractive in the sense of capturing unproductive rents. Converting those organizations into productive ones is really at the heart of the development challenge. And here policy has to be used to push organizations into learning by doing, to raise their organizational capabilities on a productive sector, without which actually no amount of devaluation, and here I may be slightly differing from Professor Elsenhans, no amount of devaluation will help, because the difference in productivity which comes from organizational capabilities is not just 50% or 60%. Even if your wages became zero, you can be competitive, even in some very basic production organized things like ask yourself, why are so few countries making garments? You can't have something simpler than garments. I'm sitting in Bangladesh. The huge success of Bangladesh in terms of manufacturing was simply cracking the organizational knowledge of how to produce a shirt. So this interface between your distribution of power and your distribution of capabilities and the policies that you are trying to use to push greater productivity growth and greater capabilities in production is where the mismatch happens. And the mismatch happens, and this is I'm summarizing very quickly, they look at institutions and policies as essentially the rules of resource allocation or rent allocation or policy resource allocation, which changes incentives and then people behave differently. But actually, you can change the rules, but people will not follow those rules unless following those rules are aligned with their interests. And to understand their interests, you have to look at so what actually happens is that if you miss out the organizations, the formal and the informal organizations, and how they're responding to the rules, you can't understand why the rules are working or are working equilibrium, or the interaction between institutions on the one hand, both formal and informal, and organizations, on the other hand, both formal and informal, but also of varying levels of capabilities. Some organizations have very strong extractive capabilities, and others have very strong or emerging productive capabilities. And how organizations will behave will depend on what kinds of compulsions they are under to change. Equilibrium, and equilibrium not in a strict sense of nothing changes, but more or less an alignment of organizational and institutional structures so that you have a stable configuration of incomes and rents that reproduce that power structure is the concept of mapping of where the society is or where the sector is, because you can look at a political settlement at a global level, a national level, a sub-national level, or a sectoral level. That mapping is the starting point for us into very damaging kinds of corruption, damaging kinds of informality and leakage. And others may also have corruption and leakage, but the policy objective is aligned with the interests or capabilities of the players, so actually capability development happens. And that is at the heart of the difference that I gave of why industrial policy was performing so differently in East Asia and South Asia. And here is the really interesting point. It doesn't mean that no industrial policy will work in South Asia. It's just that that industrial policy will have the structuration of power, capabilities, and interests. And I show that in my work in how the garments industry developed in Bangladesh, or the automobile industry and the pharmaceutical industries, both in India and the pharmaceutical industry in Bangladesh, and so on. So lots of case studies showing that when we talk about industrial policy, we have one model. And that model, usually from East Asia, worked in East Asia. But actually, that model emerged not in East Asia, but in South Asia. And it failed. That model emerged simultaneously in many places. But the specifically South Korean version of it, the South Koreans copied from Pakistan. And this is a historical fact that a lot of people don't know. So history is very important in terms of where these kinds of policy packages emerged in specific. Inside of the political settlements approach, which looks at power, capabilities, and interests, is my interpretation of political settlements, the one that I developed, but it is being used by many other groups. It is now very widely used across different research groups. And some people interpret a political settlement as an elite pact, and they look at typologies of elite pacts and different from what I am doing, and it should not be confused. My interest with this, looking at the distribution or configuration of power and capabilities and interests, is to understand how policies are implemented and the leakages that happen in terms of rent capture or misallocation out of the policy allocating rents in a way that is against the interests and capabilities of powerful informal and formal organizations, who then distort the policy to bring the distribution of rents more into line with the distribution of power. So that essential insight helps likely to work and what kinds of policies are likely to fail in very specific contexts. And this is at the heart of this whole debate between structure and agency, right? So political settlements is not deterministic coming from. Agency is very contextual, very much dependent on conjunctures, and agency, as we see all around us, does not really reflect the sum total of all the interests and power in society. The question is, once policies emerge through all kinds of accidents, then how it's implemented does depend on the configurations of power, not necessarily at the elite pact level, but how it is being implemented. Okay. So, I know I have about 5 minutes, I'm going to speed up even more. So, to apply this, actually, it's quite a problematic process. And To do this, you have to have a historical understanding of the countries you are working on, because you need to have a map in your head of how formal and informal organizations have emerged and evolved. Because without that, your mapping of the specific configurations of capabilities and power in the sector or policy that you're interested in might not be correct. Your reading of how organizations develop and your reading of the specific sector that you're looking at. And these are all hypotheses to start off with, because you might get it wrong and there are different interpretations. You then use that knowledge, that, if you like, data of the structure, to look at particular policies using, and this is where it becomes more economistic, and I use a lot of game theory language as well, to understand how different players extracting rents of policy resources in ways that are not developmental and not actually building a productive organizational capabilities that is at the heart of development, particularly in resource-poor countries. So I work actually mostly in resource-poor countries, where the only way you can become rich is by improving a productive organizational capabilities. And the final step is then looking for alternative policy designs which might work better given what you have understood about how policies have worked in the past. So this is the work that I have been doing of industrial policy in East and South Asia, then working on why good governance frameworks don't work and alternative types of governance work better, and why and where. Then going on to the anti-corruption evidence program that was mentioned, which is really an application of this approach to look at how policy resources are being captured in very specific important sectors in countries, and what can be these answers, which are getting a lot of attention now in the development field and in the Foreign Office and in the World Bank. And the next phase that we're using it for is at a very micro level, mapping power capabilities and interests in Nepal, one of the countries we work in, at the level of individual mayors and contractors and so on, building up a database which is indices, so that we can try and see if this political settlements approach can be actually used in a database approach of hypothesis testing. I don't have time to go into it. The one level that I think is really exciting, which I haven't had time to develop, is to look at how the political settlements plays out at a global level. Because one of the kind of crises that we are now in is the global distribution of power in the US in particular is being challenged all across. And I'm sitting in Bangladesh, one of the countries which is at the playing, and India playing off China, Russia, and the US in a way that was unimaginable, let's say 5 years ago even. So what we don't know is how global institutions, because what is true at the national level is also true at the global level. If the global power structures are changing, then the old global institutions won't work in the way they did and can't be enforced in the way they did. The institutions have to become aligned with the they are. And this is the source of a lot of frustration and pessimism, because we have standard answers which are based on a historic configuration of power, and they are absolutely not implementable anymore. So I can talk a lot about these extremely radical changes that are happening in developing countries. When you see the world sitting here, it looks very different from how it is very different from the world looking at it from the UK or the US. And this is a useful conversation to have, because if we are global researchers, we need to understand that you can't anymore think of global institutions in the way that we thought post-Second World War and the Bretton Woods institutions that were constructed after the Second World War. That reflected a power configuration which is now in deep at the end. I think I've ended my time, but I was asked also to say what are the problems with this framework. And I think the problems are really to do with that people don't really understand the complexity of the framework. So I've had people say to me, your framework is deterministic. It's not deterministic at all. That it supports authoritarian industrial policy. It doesn't support authoritarian industrial policy at all. In fact, it was set up to explain why authoritarian industrial policy failed in some countries and worked in other countries. People have said that it ignores agency. It doesn't ignore agency. It's about trying to figure out culture. It doesn't ignore ideology and culture. If you want to understand how these informal networks work and how they mobilize people, you can't do that without understanding ideology, culture, and so on. So I think that a lot of the problem with these complex frameworks is that they're complex. Someone has to have the patience to read through a lot of stuff and understand history to make it work. What I'm positive and optimistic about is the reception it gets from a lot of policy users. And I work with government of Bangladesh agencies, and even in a highly corrupt and very problematic government and state structure, there are agencies, and here is trying to do good. And you can work with them to try and design things which works better. So I work with an agency in Bangladesh called ADY on designing the digital systems so that they are not exclusive and they are more inclusive. We work with the World Bank, an organization which on the whole does a lot of harm, but there are people in the World Bank who are really interested in trying to figure things out, and they're very experienced foreign office, which is now called the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, because it's merged the Foreign Office with DFID. And there are lots of very good people there who are really trying to understand the world and the political settlements framework works for them. So I'm optimistic, but I think the overall global situation now is one of flux. We are unlucky enough to be born in a period when everything is changing. And so research has to become perspectives to make sense of this changing environment. I'm sorry if I've overstepped my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, very much. I think the discussion is going in a very interesting direction. And well, I would like to thank you, Professor Carlos Pereira, for joining us. I'm going to make a quick introduction of you before giving you the floor. So, Professor Bresser at the Getúlio Vargas Foundation in São Paulo. He was the finance minister of Brazil in 1987, minister of federal administration and reform of state from 1995 to 1998, Ministry of Science, Technology, and Innovation, 1999. He's also an editor of the Brazilian Journal of Political Economics, so the new developmentalism, or development macroeconomics, and he's also known for providing a consistent critique of neoclassical economics and neoliberalism. It's a pleasure to have you in Brazil still. And yes, you have 15 minutes. I will inform you on the chat when we have 5 minutes left, and I will turn my camera on when we reach the 15 minutes. The floor is yours.
How much time?
15 minutes.
Okay. Well, it's a great pleasure to speak to this so qualified audience. My colleagues in the panel, the two panels. I understand that I tried to make a talk which relates my work with the problem of extractivism. And to do that, I focused my analysis in the Dutch disease. It's important to inform before that this model of the Dutch disease I will speak on briefly is part of what I call new developmentalism, or new development or new developmental theory. I learned economics, not studying neoclassical economics, as people do, but I learned economics studying classical development economics. Development economics and Keynes before, Keynes and Brown economics. So I began heterodox, and I remain always heterodox. In early this century, when I finally left politics and had more time to work, I got in academic matters. I dedicated my time to develop this developmental new developmentalism, which is based in Keynesism and Kasselian economics, and is based on classical developmentalism, from which we have outstanding figures here in this panel. And I always thought myself also a developmentalist, a classical developmentalist. But now I propose to call these new ideas also new developmentalism. And new developmentalism, one of the more important things that it brought to development analysis is macroeconomics, that was not really in the game. And especially, I brought to the game the exchange rate, and also the current account, on the assumption that it was very clear since 2001 I began to develop this model, let's say, or this theory, that the exchange rate was a central variable in explaining economic development, and that this variable had the study of the exchange rate was very limited, and instead was limited in macroeconomics and practically inexistent in developed economics. The books I know, the chapter even is a chapter on the exchange rate. They have chapters on trade, international problems, but not the exchange rates. Well, and I started from this assumption of the high importance of the exchange rate. At the same time that several studies with no theory behind, showing that the exchange rate really was relevant. I mean, and a student of mine published already in 2007 a paper in the Cambridge Journal of Economics on this matter. Coming out of this study he made with me. Well, and in this theory, the Dutch disease and the natural resource, of course, but really the Dutch disease is a central problem. And the Dutch disease there is also this other name, not more easy to put them together. But later I decided to separate more clearly one from the other, thinking that the Dutch disease is an economic problem, while the natural resource curse is fundamentally a political and moral problem. And I realized that it was important to be orthodox economists and political science had the habitude of displaying the underdevelopment of the countries in the periphery of capitalism, always with corruption. This became a disastrous mode. And so we visited the natural resource curves that would open more, we call it drains, produced normally by oil, would be the object of this corruption. Well, I'm not denying that this is a problem, but this is not an economic problem. And for this, there is no simple solution at all. While the Dutch disease is an economic problem, and that also, in both cases, the origin is the fact that the country is a major exporter, or is mainly an exporter of commodities. And what is the Dutch disease? Disease is in a 2-week paper, was the second model. The first model was a neoclassical model, undoubtedly of Neri, Gordon and Neri, one distinguished in English and the other Australian economists. This is an important paper. Mine is more structuralist or developmental paper, and it is concerned. It is based on the idea that there is 2 equilibrium prices in the economies. There is the current equilibrium, is the exchange rate that balances intertemporally the current account of a country. This is the usual concept of balanced exchange rate, and the industrial equilibrium. That is the exchange rate that the companies or industrial projects, manufacturing companies or industrial projects require to be competitive. Well, both should be equal. Competent companies should be able to export, or at least to be able to compete with favorably with the imports of manufactured goods from other countries. And this is not what happens. There's a difference. So overvaluation of the exchange rate in relation to the manufacturing goods that derives from the exports of commodities, which can be economically profitably produced and exported at an exchange rate that the companies utilizing the best technology available in the world require. The difference between the current and industrial equilibrium is the Dutch disease, whose severity may vary a lot. The origin of this disease is not only price booms of commodities as Gordon and Neri proposed, but it is also what Ricardo rents coming out of so that even in certain countries where Dutch disease is very, very severe, even the more the countries that have low costs in producing oil, they will be facing the Dutch disease, even when the prices of oil, for instance, are not very high. Well, and this model also presented already in 2008 a method of neutralizing the disease. It was export tax, a variable export tax. I knew that there was a second one that I viewed as a second best that I didn't underline in the beginning. It was only in 2020 my attention and effort more strongly in the second method. Which is the second method? It's very simple, more easy to understand than the first. Is to set import tax on manufactured goods. This the import tax neutralizes the Dutch disease in the domestic market. What subsidy of manufactured goods does the same at the international level? Well, I decided to underline this second method because it is the method that intuitively, pragmatically, many countries adopted, and many countries exporting commodities, having the Dutch disease, adopted and industrialized America. And I believe, I firmly believe that the United States also is in this case. The United States began to be a great exporter of oil around the beginning of the 20th century. And it's very interesting, but its import tariffs for manufactured goods were extremely high until 1939. We could not explain this with the classic argument in favor of tariffs, the infant industry argument. This manufacturing industry was not infant in the United States. And in Brazil, when industrialization really became strong in the 30s, and more strongly yet in the 50s, in the 80s it made no sense to say that Brazil had an infant industry. But the import tariffs were very important in allowing Brazil and the other Latin America industrialized. Well, this is, and I realized that this is, because finally what I realized is that I had now a second argument that had come out as an unexpected consequence of the theory of the Dutch disease. It's not true that the only thing that legitimizes import tariffs is the infant industry. This was what happened everyone thought. I think that's what is that there is a second argument that legitimizes import tariffs, because I am against protectionism. I think protectionism is not a good thing. I don't think that to have tariffs when the industry is infant is a protectionist. It is to guarantee to the manufacturing company the competition with the companies projects of the other countries. The second argument, the Dutch disease argument, or the Dutch disease neutralization argument, applies the same idea. It is not protectionist to the extent that it guarantees to the industrialists of the country the same conditions of competitiveness than have the companies in other countries. Well, I'm saying that this was very much used in Latin America and in Brazil. And the success in Brazil was enormous. And Brazil is the only country that I know, probably there is not, that also adopted, now for a relatively short period, between 1969 and 1990, Brazil adopted a sport subsidy. And the outcome was incredible. The exports of manufactured goods in Brazil was 6% of total exports. 25 years later, 1990, it had became when it got incredible. Definitely incredible. Well, and what happened to the Brazilian and to Latin American economy? These countries, my country, Brazil, engaged in the neoliberal reforms. And the neoliberal turn happened in the north, in the rich country. In Latin America, it happened around 1990, 10 years later.
If you could maybe wrap it up so we can open up to the discussions. Your time has, I already exceed a little bit the timing. So if you could wrap it up and we can start.
Okay, I finished only the phrase, but
right, please.
I think it's okay. Let's go to the text figure.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. It's just, I think, yeah, we're going to push it. Great. I think now all the panelists visible. First of all, I'd like to thank so much for all your interventions in a way. Even though there are some points that are not really being agreement, I think that what it pops out for me is that the three of you have been insistent throughout your work on the state of creating efficient, driven, case-driven policies, economic policies for development and the importance of currency exchange and of allocating resources for development. But and each of you develop in a different manner. This even more for Elsenhans and for Bresser. Who has the agency to implement those policies and those like neo-developmental behind the state, right? Who are the agencies that are capable enough, powerful enough to doing that? For example, particularly for Professor Elsenhans, I question myself that the highlight of labor is extremely interesting of your research, but if labor organization in itself is weak, especially on a global level, how that it is promoted on the idea of relocating rents in order to produce economic structure. Who is behind this agency of policy development in itself? I don't know who wants to hop out and start answering my question, then we can.
I can speak. Most that for sure what's behind, directly behind developmentalism is a policy where the state intervenes moderately in the economy. So the coordination of the whole economy is made by this state and a paper that's part of what they call the political economy of new developmentalism that says that the articles that capitalism one is economic liberalism, and which is the name of the other. I realize that there is not this name. This word does not exist to say an alternative to economic liberalism as a form of word that was used of socialism. Socialism is another mode of production. And so I propose to be developmentalism, this word. Behind, there is a question, who is behind this fundamental agent of economic development associated with the state? Well, and here I think it's important to discuss for instance, we had in the post-war, post-Second World War, we have a coalition, development coalition involving businessmen, workers, the right middle class. The French regulationists for this. Well, since the dominant class coalition was a liberal class coalition, a financial venture capitalists and financiers. Small financiers, active financiers. And and this strategy they are proposing, they oppose it very strongly. So you have to have a coalition where the industrialists, the workers, and an important part of this coalition, and this may help with this policy.
Thank you. I don't know, Professor Hans, you want to wrap it up because the next on my screen.
Is it okay? You hear me?
Yes.
I find the question of Luíza very sympathetic. But I would consider is to provide arms of critique and not my analysis counts, not the question whether it's right. It is, as Professor Pereira said, it depends on the conditions, on the developments, on the basis of the expectations of the bloc in power, on the proposed goals which the bloc in power has, and on his own ideas. There is no achievement that the bloc in power will relatively fastly May 68. And I tell you, the way the French put it is different. But many secondary ones, which we as students have criticized, I give you one quote on this. When the hostels were opened, Mr. General would that all these things with the universities would destroy the Libya. Was it better before? So the change was radical, and I think it's an analysis which can be taken up. I'm actually trying to be understandable for the possible to make a compliment because what Professor Pereira is basically what he was leaving as a living example, this coalition of what is called by Lenin the Mushtaq, the relation between workers and the progressive part of business. Of us who do not believe in the automaticity of the market have some idea of this. I would add that making the market work to make the task of this bloc in power more easy, because there are some automatisms, but I think primacy of accumulation is problematic because planner who can make the investment think Professor Kahn was very clear. The microsocial capabilities and power are coinciding play a role there. Planner, and though our task is that I was very much work and the point which I is you have to create micro-social situations where the investment in productivity, those who are in control of resources, corruption and so on. I think to both of the eminent colleagues here, I would reply as much mechanism of mass consumption triggering productive investment. You shouldn't range-based sector of the economy more easy. And Professor Pereira, I think we have Professor Pereira said that I totally agree. But the basic reason is I don't think that I should evaluate my theory, because then, in my experience, you are adapting your message to what you consider as possible. But my experience, I've not as much experience in practical work as my two are very extensively in Nigeria, and my experience was its positions are comprehensible, not if they are acceptable, because if they are acceptable, they are just considered as footnotes to the degree whether they are acceptable. But if they are consistent and intellectual, so never have any influence outside crisis, there are those who are in power have no need of intellectuals. They have no need of intellectuals if there is crisis. But I have perhaps the least of the old first, but the feeling,
Okay, thank you. So, Professor Khan, do you have some remarks on the question?
Yes, so I think that the way I see the policy reality is that there isn't one actor or one coalition that is making policy who is our target audience, and they will either listen to us or not listen to us working. The policy making process is extremely complex in itself. There are many interests. Some of the agencies and organizations, and many other organizations, are involved in pushing and pulling the policy in their own interest, right? So, therefore, I don't look at states versus the organizations include political organizations. So, political players have their own interests. The state organizations and in many developing countries, tons of civil society organizations are also extremely important, and they development. So what you have is a lot of noise going on, right? There's a lot of noise, and policy emerges through some kind of parallelogram of forces after this, right? So you can try and see how policy is made, but I'm much more interested in, can this policy be implemented? Pricing, so any developing country is trying to increase industrial output, is trying to get more power supply, is trying to improve urban housing, is trying to improve the health. This is not surprising. So, the people who are trying to get the policy resources for themselves. So, if you're talking about the health sector, doctors will be a big lobbying group. Nurses are a big sector, is a lobbying group. the government has its election campaign. You have a lot of agencies and organizations fighting here. Now, where does the intellectual come in? The context in which all this is happening. Then, can you implement the policy? Right? So a policy emerges. We will have more private sector clinics. Is that implementable in the context of this country? Or we will spend more money on the public sector? Will this money simply disappear somewhere? To me, those are the most interesting questions. Not should we spend on health or not. That's a higher level question, and there I agree with you that you can say this, but no one might listen, and if they listen, that's good. That we are not going to make a big impact on that. For example, the businesses in Bangladesh or in India want to get more into manufacturing. They want to develop their product. It's a consensus. Everyone is saying that. So different groups, but then the policy emerges in such a way that these resources will be captured by one or two powerful groups, and nothing will. Where the cleavages are in all these power structures, can you come up with a suggestion that other powerful players in their own interest will say, actually, those guys that are capturing these resources is not going to go anywhere. Maybe the policy should be designed differently. The policy advisor, the intellectual, and the real world are actually acting in line, right? That no one listens to, nor are we trying to sell an idea to someone who already wants an idea and interest, and saying, where are the cleavages? How do we split it? How do we actually get a more public, welfare-oriented, development-oriented outcome? And this is neither state versus market, because sometimes the state is the plate that are trying to capture the rents. Sometimes it is the private sector. Sometimes it is political clientelist organizations. Sometimes it is nurses groups or cancer. I think that my answer is not that capitalism is good or bad. And I completely agree with Professor Elsenhans. We should not do things, or everything that the market does is a bad thing. I'm interested in, and the answer might be different in different countries. Right? So in one country, in other countries, privatizing them might be a disaster. It might be resulting in deaths of people. So there is, in some countries, centralized industrial policy is a very good thing. In others, a capture of rents and it miserizes the population and raises prices. So what is your industrial policy depends on that configuration of it. And then, since this debate is already going on, you find allies with yours. So this is the important point. It's not that we are trying to say things which are aligned with the most powerful interests. We are trying to say things which are aligned with the interests of people who are market creating more jobs, creating more productivity. That's our ally. And we have to complicate the answer, but it's somewhere in between saying that it's not our job to change policy, and I agree with write a treatise which is very consistent, and then if someone picks it up, it is good. I mean, it has to be somewhere in the middle, right? These debates and these fights that are going on, and intervening with something that someone finds useful, who is actually beneficial to society. So that's how I would position the political settlements analysis.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much. We have some questions from the audience. So I think it's better for me to kind of very quickly, while you're wrapping up what you're just saying, because as an intellectual, right, middle route, not necessarily answering questions, but also developing theories. And as you say, we need to bring this stuff and read more. And you're saying on the necessities of doing comparisons. Could you answer more or less quickly more to create the thought crucial to be developed? And from that on, I would go to the questions of the audience.
So I think what we can learn from other examples, other countries, is how they solve the problem, but we don't, right? So this is the issue. So to understand that, you really have to understand what is implementable and in line with organizations as they really are in your place, which might be extremely different from the next country down the road, right? Forget about the United States, different from Burma on the Myanmar on the one side and India on the other, and even different parts of Bangladesh are quite different from each other. So to give you an example, a policy which will create water bodies which are managed by local people, because these water bodies have fish, and fish farming requires some forms of property rights. But there are different ways of creating these property rights, and most of them don't work. How it has been attempted, it has been driven by a kind of development partner consensus about how best to do it. For example, mainly by saying, and then you match the equity problem with the property rights problem, and you control the free access, while also liberty. But when you try to implement it, you find that these poor fishermen have no capacity to enforce these. We tried for 30 years different variants of it, millions and millions of dollars of aid money and borrowed money from the World Bank and from the Asian Development Bank. This is the institution. This is how it should work. Like, along comes an NGO, and this NGO brings together the whole bunch of this NGO sets up what they call a community enterprise, the poor and the landless, but also the landlords. And now you have the enforcement capacity at the local levels. And suddenly, the production of fish goes up. And suddenly, you have a huge reduction in solutions. And an intermediary solution, which is much more energy, 40 years to discover this. Now, what we would say is that if you want to work in a place, first understand the history of that country. And those examples in that country, not some other country, you will understand what is the configuration of power and capability. Examples that people should start looking at is look at what works in Nigeria, if you're trying to understand Nigeria. Look at what doesn't, how do you actually align those interests and incentives and capabilities to produce productive and pro-poor inclusive outcomes. But supporting those things which can be implemented in that country. And then why do things that work in some other country not work in your country? Right? So industrial policy came and said Ethiopia is the next industrial development state in Africa. I was one of the few who was saying at that time, it's not going to work because the configuration of power in Ethiopia is so radically different that, and I worked for a couple of years in Ethiopia, and
I think it's, wow, we lost him. You back? Great. You are muted.
So the answer is you should not design an industrial policy in Ethiopia by looking at South Korea. You should not. So these may have worked in Ethiopia, and maybe it would have been better off trying to learn from Bangladesh as to how to develop the garments industry and not from the South Koreans. So I think though these are configured, look at examples which are close to yours in terms of those configurations of power activities. But the best is to start looking at your other way. That's what we do in advanced countries. We don't look at some far away, didn't work in the last phase, and why not? Let's learn from that and build up. When we go to developing countries, we kind of abandon that approach, and we have pure theory informing.
Thank you very much. I'm going here to the questions on the audience. There's a question for Professor which I find very interesting, which was from Martin Beck. He says that he's intrigued by the agnostic market. It's possible to find a way to overcoming rentierism. And he's asked for the Arab Gulf states to overcome rentierism would be to empower migrant workers who are the vast majority of the labor force. Basically, what he's asking if Elsenhans would agree that the Arab Gulf states are overcoming rent, because the rule is based on acquiring legitimacy through citizens who are strongly opposed to empowering the migrant forces, which are the main sources of labor in those countries. So if Professor Lee could answer.
If I have understood well, yeah, I think the migrant workers, it's migrant workers which was asked for.
Basically, what the majority of the labor force in this country
are migrant workers. I think basically the empowerment of any workers, which then the basic mechanism was internal markets create incentives for investment. Migrant workers is okay. The question is the migrant worker, which is the status is basically in the 19th century in the rural valley. Most workers were migrant workers coming from Polish provinces. That was so much that Polish majorities. So I think empowering the migrant workers would be the solution. The political figure of the migrant worker, to make the migrant worker a citizen, that would be the first step. In rent-based societies, it's a high against any other movement. There is no chance no time to develop that. And in capitalism, it's an absolutely exception of the large majority of the one which is called class consciousness. And if you have class consciousness describing are different from the one where you have no general consciousness of things. As far as I've understood the question now, the argument is migrant workers should be empowered, but the market with migrant workers, the Latin American countries, there is the question now how you are making the access of was very close to Mr. Pereira that you have to support rising mass incomes. I'm very close to Mr. Kanya because political transformation of this empowerment requires exactly this type of action.
Thank you very much for your answer. I think it's a very complex case of the migrant workers in Arab countries that create on the question of not believing or just saying how the question labor force, and the migration is conditioned by the contracts, so that may be a little bit more difficult to imagine.
Luíza, it was on Arab countries or Latin America. Arab, these titles on the personal world have been created to keep population from reaching 1973 before the oil crisis. In a German-French conference, I said, this is dysfunctional because it said that there are populated countries where they can make something from the money by investing of the local participating in the conference. And I was back to the conference by the exact metropolitan type of this coalition by the French when I was very young, so continue to participate. I think some of the arrangements have been made by imperialism.
I would go back to maybe some of the questions that we sent before of the orientation of the project, and then maybe initiate my question more considering issues of methodology or how to do orthodox economy. So we've been talking about this before and so on. And also the emergence of new crises, right? Environment, new types of discrimination becoming the center of our discussion, and even being part of broad. And as a well-established orthodox economist from the global south, right? Could you be able to pinpoint to us some essential analytical piece of the complexities of those social economic situations we live in today that we should not forget, that comes from orthodox studies, come from structuralism, and that we can further this idea of revision or bringing structuralism back in.
Well, in this very interesting, but there are macroeconomic ideas, I would say, as Hans also said, our capabilities and the interests and how to align them. It's very interesting. And he said also that all countries want to do. It is very interesting, the difficulties these countries. Okay. What I used to say in this case is that economists is just industrial policy. They say, okay, this is wonderful, it's very necessary, but you have to have the conditions for that. Growth is a problem of creating general condition, also to consider the macro variables. Something that the development economists don't do, but they should do, because growth depends on investment, and investment depends on the rate of profit and the interest rate. And all this very simple. When you look what happened in the last 50 years, you see that the only country that really had a normal industrial policy, they did good industrial policy. They had a good coalition before. They had a good coalition before. But a macroeconomic policies which define the macroeconomic prices are right, and this is essential. The importance of mass consumption. I fully agree with this. You need demand. Development is mass consumption. It is increasing of the standards of living of people. And he wants effect in the population, is right. Luiza asked me which methodological tool to look methodological critique of neoclassical economics. It's a paper, 2 papers, and the other is economic historical models and economic syllogisms. And so I am given the method they use, the hypothetical method. The theories that they develop are not relevant of the developing countries. Elsenhans was made a mention of imperialism. This is very important. The ideas that we have today imperialism is done essentially through hegemonic, ideological hegemony. And the ideological hegemony was along of the United States and of liberalism. And the countries all over the world suffered from this. The way they still use some some force, military force, now can observe this. The world is changing and changing fast toward the east. And this is very good. New views on the world and of the economy appear, new methods of achieving it. New development use this methods to choose. One thing interesting is say, but you spoke about tariffs, so you believe that the very important industrial policy that the country should use, they don't use it. Yeah, they don't. They don't use because they don't need it. And they don't need it because the industry is not important anymore. And because they don't have, nor can be normally exporters of commodities as the main sport. They are either since the beginning industrial countries that are, it must have a macroeconomics together with some microeconomics. The method is putting together these two levels of this.
Thank you.
Hope
Thank you very much. Anybody else would like to add up on this question on what are the article theoretical tools analysis in, or if not, we can go to some of the questions from the audience. No?
I think that, I would very briefly say that kinds of questions I'm asking, the really important categories are the relationships between institutions or rules, distorted in many ways. So even formal rules in their actual countries. So institutions is one pillar, then organizations and their capabilities another pillar, and connecting the two is this question of rents. And I do the analysis of rents, which is capable of addressing all the different flows that we are talking about, is really a very interesting agenda. And I've worked, which is really important. Now, the way in which a lot of economists think of rents, I'm not talking about classical, right? So I'm talking about modern economic discussions of rents from institutional economists and so on. They think of rents as some policy or intervention, right? So if you have a pattern, you create an innovation rent, or if you have some kind of rent. But actually, if you think about it, markets as institutions are also interventions. Property rights are interventions. Property rights income that goes to a property owner is also, in that sense, underpinned by an enforcement of a right. Just like an innovation rent is an income flow that comes from the of how to manage open access resources. Creating a property right on that creates an income for the people who manage that entry into that open. What we are talking about is all of the incomes that comes from a modern organized economy are based on some underpinned rights or institutions that countries that we've taken a lot of those older rights as normal, and so we don't think And this is wrong. So to me, a capitalist profit is just as much based on somebody enforcing that property right as innovation trend is based on somebody enforcing a patent or an actual resource. So the more general way of thinking about it, and I don't want to go into a kind of doctrine, what do you call it, right? You might say, I don't want to call it a rent. Let's call it income flows based on the enforcement of rights. To me, that's the interesting thing. So the question is, which rights are enforced for organizations and their interests and capabilities comes in? So this, to me, is a really exciting area of institutional economics. This kind of interface between institutional organization, how what is going on, and why a lot of policies fail and some policies work. So that's my response.
Thank you very much for your comment. It was exactly Professor Elsenhans wants to pinpoint something I would say. However, brief, because I wanted to do a final round before we wrap up our first panel to the second. So it could be a little brief on our comments and we can extend a little bit. Am I the only one not listening?
There's no sound.
I think there's something on your microphone. I'm so sorry, but we're not listening to you, Professor. No. So sorry, I think maybe we're not listening to you. Well, just while the professor is fixing his microphone, just to wrap it up, because the idea of this panel is that the next is the next generation, right? It is younger scholars from different areas that was one of the main reasons also main contributions I think Professor Reinhardt would have brought economy as a discipline sometimes go to a more fantasy detached from the need to be more case historical driven, but it's still with the goal of doing theory that is aware of structural pressures. So my final question that I would ask you to make 1 minute comment more or less is this, your lifetime, the course that we've been discussing here, political setup, now the developmentalism, state as open to further development to this generations. What are the elements or approach that you would say that should be the new input or the new advance or progress of your own approach? Professor,
okay.
Professor,
no. I know that the ideas based on macroeconomics usual in the area of development studies and development economics. But I think that this is taking consideration because these micro problems, I like very much the idea of the alignment of interests and sorry, of capabilities and organization that can speak about, but can bring new things. But I think that are being done all the time, and they take a long time to make. While this, if you have an exchange rate that is will be impossible, period. And to change this is you just to have to change your macroeconomic policy. What's not wrong behind that? You know that. And this is very important. But I think that there is a new thing to develop economists that they should really take in consideration.
Great. Professor Kahn, would you like to wrap it up with your points?
Yes, I think that there's no limit to what people should be interested in. They should be interested in everything. And I think that the issue in commodity exporting countries, obviously. But there are a lot of countries which are not commodity exporting countries, right? I mean, so a lot of Asian countries are not raw materials and resources. So here, if I'm sitting in South Asia, the problem is, and these are not small problems, and I would say that the way in which they have been answered in the past have been largely wrong, right? So what we are saying in which the political settlement, the configuration of power and capabilities, constrains what is implementable, and that design, which is not minor. The other thing that I think that the new generation or younger generation, I mean, I don't want to continue working for some time, but younger colleague, so I think of which I've already talked about. So the issue of rents and how that connects to the new global economy, which is and it is extremely interesting and important, because even in a lot of developing countries, manufacturing is becoming quite difficult. So it's developing countries are also deindustrializing. There is this issue really of how you can have private jobs and create that welfare. So, for example, even in India, which is really a poor country, you already have jobs. So then there's this additional question of actually converting some of the surplus from the rest of the population. This is a hugely important area, which is also the subject of rents analysis. What are the power and capabilities of the different players will determine welfare going forward. Because I think that model that many of us, yes, it's still working in Bangladesh because it's working at the bottom of the value chain. It's already stopped working in many parts of India. So there are some really, and then which also require many significant transfers. And as soon as you have transfers, whether for welfare reasons or because you're not getting enough jobs, then you have to ask these very serious questions about how you're going to manage these transfers. And those are, again, questions of rents. So I would say institutions, organizations, and rents are things that people are talking about. I'm not saying we shouldn't study macroeconomics or other things. Not at all. But these are just mine.
Professor Elsenhans, is your microphone?
I have everything checked. Can you understand me now?
Yeah, we can listen to you.
Okay.
If you have some final remarks,
Okay, fine. Yeah. I wanted to intervene now because I think to be reinvested in order to be reproduced in economic efficiency, but actions is important, and therefore I do not follow Mr. Castro. But there is a difference between profit and rent that at least is important for my theory. For the rest, basically, the Mushtaq that we have to accept that anybody makes something different. I analyze to both of the other eminent colleagues, because I share the idea about that disease necessity for catch up. I share the analysis of the chaotic sense that there are all these different groups and some sort of political structure which appropriates the sometimes. But my own position is determined by the limits of my everything. And I have said basically, I think that whatever happens create profit, and therefore rising mass incomes are the basis of an independent bourgeoisie. That may be illusory, as some of one of the questions was, other thing, because basically I'm facing a mainstream where the argument is centralizing is the central thing, and all what I have done is to revise this position with respect to the theory of capitalism. And therefore, I'm beautiful, but I can plug only some.
Now it's me that I'm muted. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have to wrap it up to start the second panel. I will participate on the discussion. We're going to make a 10 minutes break, at least, just to change time around, change the moderator, and we. For me, it's now 18:12. I want to thank you once again, the three panelists, for this discussion. It was really interesting, and hope you join us for the next session with Ingrid, Sarah, Fernando, and John. We started doing the change of